We're here. All right. Well, there may still be a few people that show up, I hope, but we're probably should get going, since there's way more to talk about than can be handled in 1 hour, as is the case for most of these concepts that we've been looking at. So this morning we're looking at the word law, which in Hebrew is Torah. In Greek, the word is nomos. And the reason I took this one on was because of the discussion in the class that I taught 3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago, on covenant. We talked about covenant stipulations being much of what we consider law from the Old Testament. And there was some vigorous discussion about what that means for us nowadays, which I'm still not quite prepared to answer, but I thought it would be good to get into a little bit deeper look at that concept of law. And so I've got some things to say about it today, but I certainly do not have everything to say about it. We will not get into some of the more challenging discussions about how that all applies to us today and different standpoints over the years on what the law means for those of us who are Gentile members of the church as opposed to the people of Israel prior to Christ's coming. Okay, so starting to look at the word itself, some of the translations that you find for Torah suggest that it's a much broader concept in Hebrew than what we think of with law in English. So some translations we'll go through. And what I've done in a lot of these is I want to show two different translations because I want you to see that even the translators are wrestling at times with which shade of meaning to use for translating any particular instance of this word. So Genesis 26:5, because Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. That last word, laws, is Torah, and it's, despite the English plural, it's actually a singular word in Hebrew. And then the same, that's the NRSV, which is the Pew Bible that we use in this church. And then another translation, because Abraham obeyed me and did everything I required of him, keeping my commands, my decrees, and my instructions. And that word translated in English as instructions is, again, the Torah in Hebrew. That's the NIV translation. Exodus chapter 13, verse 9, it shall serve for you as a sign on your hand and as a reminder on your forehead, so that the teaching, Torah, of the Lord may be on your lips. For with a strong hand the Lord brought you out of Egypt. So that's the NRSV. Same verse in the NIV. This observance will be for you like a sign on your hand and a reminder on your forehead that this law, Torah, of the Lord is to be on your lips. For the Lord brought you out of Egypt with his mighty hand.
There's the word statutes used there. We sometimes incorporate that into our
right
concept of law.
Yeah, and there are various other words. We'll see a couple more of them, at least briefly mentioned, but there is a technical vocabulary for legalistic type of things in Hebrew, just as there is in English. Like we have statutes, regulations, laws, decrees. There's these various words that we can use that all have a legal flavor to them. Mm-hmm. And the same is true in Hebrew, of course. There are a number of different words. Leviticus 6, verse 9, command Aaron and his sons, saying, this is the ritual, Torah, of the burnt offering. The burnt offering itself shall remain on the hearth upon the altar all night until the morning, while the fire on the altar shall be kept burning. So that's the NRSV that we have here in this church. Give Aaron and his sons this command. These are the regulations, Torah, of the for the burnt offering. The burnt offering is to remain on the altar hearth throughout the night till morning, and the fire must be kept burning on the altar. Going on a little later in that same book, Leviticus is rich with uses of the word. The same law, Torah, applies to both the sin offering and the guilt offering. They belong to the priest who makes atonement with them. That's the NIV. The NRSV, the guilt offering is like the sin offering. There's the same ritual, Torah, for them. The priest who makes atonement with it shall have it. So you can see some shades of meaning that are coming out here as the translators wrestle with what to do in any given case with this word.
So are you saying that the Hebrew doesn't make any distinction in those various situations?
It's the same word used in all of these situations. Sometimes it seems to have the shade of law, sometimes ritual, sometimes teaching, sometimes regulations. Like there's a broad range of meanings associated with this.
Cognate words in Hebrew that would shed light on it?
That's a good question that I'm not really in a position to answer because I didn't research all cognates. But
Is the language simply is the language simply simpler, or is it that the words themselves are?
this is a word that's got a fairly complex range of meanings. And I don't think it's that the language is necessarily simpler. They have other words they could use. And that first verse that we looked at, my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws, those are all different words, right? It's not like there aren't other words that can be used to describe some of these ideas.
So what defines the word? Is it just the context?
Yeah, I mean, when it's translated into English, the translators have to wrestle with what is the context here and what's the shade of meaning that's trying to be presented. But what I'd like to get across is that the word itself has a very broad range. It's not as simple as law. And there's a absolutely brilliant quote that I'm going to give you later. I just loved it. I think it'll resonate in this crowd, I think. More translations. Numbers 15:16. You and the alien who resides with you shall have the same law, Torah, and the same ordinance. And then a different translation, same verse, the same laws and regulations. So sometimes it's this idea of a law, sometimes it's the idea of laws, plural, like a body of law. That comes across. So it's got that range as well, because in both cases, it's a singular word in Hebrew. Deuteronomy 4, verse 44. This is the law that Moses set before the Israelites. And for the first time, we actually have agreement in the translators. They both translate the same way. This is the law Moses set before the Israelites. Psalm 1, verse 2. I think I forgot to take the bottom one off because it's actually on the next slide. But their delight is in the law of the Lord, and on his law they meditate day and night. Both uses of law in this word and this verse are Torah. And again, the alternate translation uses the same word. But I'd like you to stop and think about that for just a second. Think about what law is today. Can anybody imagine meditating day and night and taking delight in the Criminal Code of Canada?
No. No, I was thinking that. Very few people who would say they take delight in the law.
Yeah. I mean, it suggests that we're talking about something a little different here. Psalm 78, verse 1. Give ear, O my people, to my teaching. Torah. Incline your ears to the words of my mouth. And again, different translation, but the same word used in English. My people, hear my teaching.
And yet, I mean, to me, the tone of those psalms feels similar in both the case of it's something that the people as a whole should take joy in and so forth.
Yes.
It's not like why Why would they choose in one case to say teaching, in one case to say law?
Well, shades of meaning, right?
Why?
Yeah, and in this case, part of it seems to be that it's my Torah, like, right? It's the person explicating the Torah, um, explaining and talking about the law, and so it's teaching.
Huh.
Some other shades of meaning that come out in these next couple verses. Psalm 119, 126 is time for you to act, Lord. Your law is being broken, your Torah. And then in a different translation for the same verse, I think I typoed the verse number, but it is the same verse. Streams of tears flow from my eyes, for your law, Torah, is not obeyed. Actually, that might be a different verse. But these two verses give the idea of law as something that can be broken. This is much more closer to our concept of law. Like I think about the Criminal Code of Canada, for example, as law, right? If you do such and such thing, you're breaking the law. These verses suggest that that word can include that concept, but it might not always be that concept in play. That's one of the things you need to keep in mind. And then a couple other translations, both of which use the word teaching. And for Psalm 78:1, give ear, O my people, to my teaching, incline your ears to the words of my mouth. Couple more from later in the prophets. Isaiah 8:20, for teaching, Torah, and for instruction. Consult God's instruction, Torah, and the testimony of warning. So teaching, instruction sort of fall into this broad idea of Torah.
So it can be used as both a verb and a noun?
How you translate it in this case can make use of either a verb or a noun, because the structures don't always line up neatly. How the sentence is formed. But you have turned aside from the way. You have caused many to stumble by your instruction, Torah. You've corrupted the covenant of Levi. So here's this association between the covenant and the law, right? Which we talked about. You have turned from the way, and by your teaching, or Torah, have caused many to stumble. You have violated the covenant with the Levi. So
is there a sense of, like, if corrupted is an interesting word there. Is there a sense of purity to Torah that
a lot of Torah is about purity? Yes. I mean,
like, is the covenant itself, or is the Torah the pure way kind of idea, or
it explains how to be pure.
Yeah.
I mean, we talked about that somewhat with Dell when he presented on purity, the concept of purity. Okay, moving on to the Greek, and I have much less to say about the Greek because it's much simpler in its usage. It's almost always the word that's used for Torah when it's referenced in the New Testament is almost exclusively nomos. And nomos is almost always translated in English as law. Some examples, Matthew 5:17. Do not think I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish, but to fulfill. So that's NRSV, and then the same word law used in NIV. One interesting distinction and exception to that general rule is in Hebrews 7:16. One who has become a priest not through a legal requirement. And this is how they've chosen to render this into English. But it's the same word, nomos.
Matthew references, they're referring back to what we would call the Old Testament, and for the law, which consists of the law, the writings, and the prophets.
Right, and I have a slide on that at the moment.
Okay.
Yeah, so you're anticipating me, which is great. So Hebrews 7:16, one who has become a priest not on the basis of a regulation. So again, that idea of regulation, sort of a legal term, but not law.
a legal requirement in to do with?
Yeah.
Dissent.
Yeah, in
Dissent.
English, the word being used is more of a legal type of word rather than the word law itself, but it's that idea.
Yeah, the idea of a hereditary thing.
Yeah. Okay, so next slide, and here's where Annabelle's point comes out. Aside from the broad range of meanings for the word Torah in the Hebrew scriptures, there is a specific usage of this word to refer to the collection of books, sometimes also referred to as the Pentateuch. In the traditional Hebrew scriptures, these books, which in our Bible we usually know as Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, are collectively referred to as Torah. That's the term. So the Hebrew scriptures divide into three divisions traditionally: the Torah, which is these 5 books, the prophets, which is much more extensive than what we think of as prophets, includes some of the historical books like Samuel that we don't think of as prophet. And then the writings, which tends to be the Psalms, the Proverbs, and a few other oddballs, Ecclesiastes.
When young Jewish men begin to study the scriptures and they are studying the Torah, is that referring only again to these 5 books?
Well, then again, the next step in the usage is extending the Torah to extend not just to those 5 books, but more broadly to the entire body of the Hebrew scriptures. That's less common, but it is used that way. And so that usage of Torah as a label for the written material is often carried into the use of nomos in the New Testament, especially because now you're talking about these written materials and how are you going to refer to them? It's usually the law, sometimes the law and the prophets. They don't generally refer to the writings, but the writings were a much smaller portion of that. So
the writings includes the Psalms and the Proverbs.
The writings would be the Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, a few other smaller ones that don't seem to fit neatly. So it's often not clear whether this word is being used narrowly or broadly when you're talking about its use as a reference to scripture. Like, are we talking about just the legal portion of the books of the Pentateuch? Are we talking about the entire Pentateuch taken as a whole? Are we talking about the entire scripture? Like, it could mean any of those. And sometimes you have to guess as to which shade of meaning is envisioned. Okay, here's the quote that I absolutely loved and wanted to bring to you. If our legal systems are like American, or I could say Canadian, football, then biblical law is like the Winter Olympic sport of curling. Both score with a keen sense, both are team sports. Both score with a keen sense of boundaries. Both have a specific goal. But curling and football are practiced in such different arenas, physically and conceptually, that they are difficult to compare directly. Isn't that a great quote?
Yeah.
I think it tells you a lot about how we tend to think about law as opposed to how an Israelite might have thought about law. They are very different. I think a couple weeks ago, Reed started his discussion by talking about the idea of heaven and his work in a funeral home. Well, full disclosure, I work for the courts. Now, my job is mostly technical. I'm not a lawyer. However, I have had to sit through probably more court than most non-lawyers would ever need to. And I've had to watch the lawyers, practice law. And it's not like the TV.
Boring.
It can be quite boring, but it's also got some real logic and traditions to it that aren't readily apparent if you don't live in that world. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about legal codes in the ancient Near East, now that we've sort of talked about the range of meaning that Torah has, because I think it helps us understand a little bit about what the law is doing in the Old Testament. Legal codes such as the Code of Hammurabi exist and can be seen as parallels to portion of the Old Testament Torah code. So you see some of the same rules, in regards to what happens in certain circumstances, very, very similar. And so it's hard not to miss the fact that, this Old Testament law didn't develop in a vacuum. There were influences around it. The Old Babylonian Code of Hammurabi is often cited as one of the earliest law codes. However, here's the interesting thing. Of the thousands of clay tablets containing legal decisions that have been excavated in Mesopotamia, none appeal to, cite, or allude to Hammurabi's code, and many flatly contradict it. Yeah. Now that's an interesting thing. It suggests that whatever Hammurabi's code was, it's not what we think of when we think of law. Like, you can't imagine a Canadian court going, oh, well, criminal code, we won't mention that in our decisions, and it won't matter if we break the rules set out in the criminal code, right? You just can't imagine such a thing being done. But in the old,
I think the Canadian judges are doing that now.
well, okay, maybe as a non-lawyer sort of looking at the end result, you might sometimes think that. There are some reasons for that, which, if you actually sit through court, sometimes become a little more clear.
We're has to interpret.
But there's a lot of interpretation that goes on. But the interesting thing is that whatever Hammurabi's code wasn't, it wasn't a legal set of guidelines that judges actually had to pay close attention to and reference and use as the basis for their decisions. It was doing something else. That was the point being made here. And here's another quote from the same book, which is called Understanding Biblical Law. I have my sources at the end of this presentation for you if you want to go back and look at any of them. Why does it matter that Hammurabi's famous law code was not cited in legal decisions? It shows that law did not function conceptually in the same way it does for us today. Ancient Near East laws expressed principles and offered guidance to judges, maybe even plaintiffs and defenders. Of course, our laws today express principles, but the legislated statutes that make up legal code are not merely guiding, but binding. Ancient Near East common law traditions aimed at training the discernment of elders, judges, and kings, persons who needed to wisely adjudicate justice for the vulnerable. So here's where that concept of instruction, teaching, starts to come really into prominent view. The law was not what we think of as law, a set of statutes that had to be rigidly followed. It was instruction, guidance. It was explicating basic principles. Now, speaking of the ancient Near East law codes, another point that came out of some of the reading I did. One significant difference between the Torah and neighboring law codes is the interweaving of law and narrative. Torah is both a response to and illustrated by the interwoven narrative. If you think of the 5 books that are the Torah in the Old Testament, Genesis has nothing in it that we would recognize as law. It's story. Yeah. There's maybe 1 or 2 situations where God gives a direct, regulation, you shall not eat from the tree, or, things along those nature, but it's mostly story. It's not law. And yet, for some reason, it's considered part of the Torah. Yes?
I would suggest that is because the stories illustrated in those, especially in Genesis, are a story of relationship.
Yes.
And law is about relationship. It is about what is good for our relationship as individuals, our relationship with the broader community. And that the Torah illustrates how we are to relate to God and how God relates to us.
At a philosophical level, yes. I think your point
And
is
that sets what is right and what is wrong in that relationship.
right.
Or explores that. Anyways, that's
Yeah.
my thought.
Another point to make, Torah is not a simple list of do's and don'ts. Jewish tradition identifies 613 mitzvot, which is the Hebrew word for commandment, within the Torah. I mean, that's going through and trying to parse out, okay, in all of this long mixture of narrative and sort of legalistic guidance, what's a commandment? So, like, what is it that we're being told to do or to not do? And so they went through and found 613 of them. That's the tradition, at least. However, the structure of the Torah is very akin to common law. Specific cases exemplify larger principles which may not be clearly spelled out, but which are foundational. I'm going to tell a story sort of out of school here. Recently, and I won't give too many details, but recently, as a result of supporting some remote participant court hearing, I sat through much of a court hearing. The case had to do with a man who had confessed to murder while being interviewed with an RCMP officer who was there to do a wellness check on him and his wife. There were some fairly complicated circumstances. The wife was in late stages of dementia, and you could easily see it as a mercy killing out of frustration with the inability of the medical system to deal with the complexities of his wife's situation. But there was a long argument about whether or not the confession was valid based on the circumstances and the information given by the RCMP officer to him and the way things were handled and the lack of a search warrant and lots of looking at the broad scope of the law. Now, none of this is clearly spelled out in statute. This is all a case of interpretation and looking at past precedents. Like the legal arguments were not the legal, were not that the law says this and this was violated. It was the broad principle that the law is intended to honor, as seen in these previous court cases that were not the same but had elements the same, suggest that something was done wrong here and that therefore this confession isn't valid. I have no idea how the case was decided. I didn't sit through to the very end, and even if I had, the decision probably would have been reserved and I wouldn't have heard it. But it was very interesting to see the process and how there's looking at the situation and how it relates to previous situations. That's the common law approach, right? And that is the ethos behind much of the Old Testament law. It's situational.
Common as distinguished from what?
Common as distinguished to statutory. Everything's very black and white. You either did this or you didn't do it, and you kept the law or you broke it. Now, another comment coming out of some of the reading I've done about Torah in the Old Testament. Keeping, the Hebrew word is shamar. Keeping the Torah means much more than obedience to a rule or compliance with a legal regulation. The term is also translated in other contexts as gardening, tending, shepherding, or caring for, as well as guarding or watching over. When you keep the law, you're not just living inside the letter of the law. You're doing something much broader.
Mhm.
You're shepherding and tending the principles behind the law, which is why you can meditate on the law day and night, because this is about applying the principles that come out of these very specific um, guidelines given in the Torah. And how does that apply in this other related situation that I'm facing in my day-to-day life today? One of the authors of one of the books had a really interesting approach to this. He actually posed almost a murder mystery and talked about the legal, and it was interspersed with his commentary on the law. It was this narrative, sort of following this interspersing of law and narrative, right? And so between chapters, he'd have this short episode of this death and how the village had wrestled with the legal issues it posed. As case, I mean, the specifics in this case were a visitor who had got drunk and, been hosted and got drunk with having a good time with his host, and then had wandered off the edge of the roof in the night and fallen to his injury and later death. And I mean, there are some legal principles that touch on that in the Torah, right? And how do you interpret that? What are the responsibilities of the village in that case? That was sort of the storyline.
Mhm.
But it was very interesting. And I mean, it's not just about the legalistic, okay, I was driving 32 in a school zone and therefore I have broken the law, right? I mean, that's a very legalistic, rigid approach. But it's more along the lines of, okay, I'm a police officer dealing with a really complex situation. And what are my legal responsibilities in this situation? Like, what do I need to do this properly? That's the sort of case that I saw in this, court matter that I attended.
Lawyers and judges, but it's also police officers.
Oh, no, it's anyone involved in the justice system in any way, including, those of us who are citizens. So here's another quote. Keeping the law in biblical texts is something akin to tending to its constructive and instructive methods so that the law does what it is supposed to do, cultivate the community's discernment and proliferate justice in the land.
True.
I mean, that is the author's take on what the purpose of Torah is in the Old Testament.
There's that gardening and tending.
Yeah, there's the gardening and tending imagery. Another quote from the same book. Common law treats customs and traditions as part of the legal thinking and process. Law codes were treated as guidance rather than as statutes to be enforced.
Is this where, I mean, the word ritual was used at some point, but we tend to associate ritual with culture.
Yeah, well, ritual, I mean, when you actually look at the mitzvot, the commandments, many of them have to do with ritual. They have to do with how sacrifices are to be made. What type of purity do you need to have to go into the sacrifice? And there's a lot there that may not be that relevant to us. One of the points that was made in talking about one of the books I read, really interesting book, it's called Leviticus on the Butcher Block, Making Head or Tail of the Bible's Most Confusing Book. And the author is actually a butcher who approached that book with his knowledge of butchery and what it means to actually prepare an animal for consumption. And he pointed out that much of the sacrificial stuff is about butchery, and it's about presenting meat. It's not about you don't sacrifice an animal, you sacrifice the meat from the animal and maybe some of the internal organs, but you are butchering and presenting parts. And they made the point that, like some of the authors made the point, sacrifice was not something that God, demanded of the people and that they came to unwillingly. Sacrifice was a normal part of the culture and something people did very, very willingly. And one of the reasons was because the sacrificial ritual was very tied up with the communal eating of meat. It was almost the only time you would eat meat was if it was associated with a sacrifice. And so you didn't have to twist people's arms into sacrificing. They sacrificed quite happily and readily because it meant they would feast on meat. What you had to do was regulate how those sacrifices were happening. And that's much of what the sacrificial regulations in Old Testament are about, is trying to put some boundaries on how and when these sacrifices take place, not to encourage people to do something they didn't want to do. And that's an aspect of it that it's easy for us to miss because we don't sacrifice in order to get meat. We go to the grocery store. We're very separated from that process of raising an animal, butchering it, and then eating the meat right then and there. That's unless you're a farmer or a hunter. But we live in a very different world than the ancient Near East culture.
That's even an example of common law treating customs and traditions. It's said because right now, MAID is making judges think differently
Yeah,
about that particular law.
yeah.
That would have been very complex, that situation you spoke of.
These are, yeah, it really is, yeah. And I want to point out that a lot of these complexities come into play when we look at what Torah is and how it was used. And I want to go through some of the situational aspects of the Torah, because we often think of it as very black and white. It is not. There are a lot of complexities. So some of the situational aspects. First of all, space can affect the Torah and how it's applied. For example, the rules for ceremonial purity apply differently in the tabernacle or the temple vicinity than elsewhere. Outside of the temple vicinity, ceremonial purity is almost taken for granted. You're going to be impure, and it's not a big deal. It doesn't mean you can't eat. If it meant you couldn't eat, any woman who was menstruating would go a week without eating. Like, there are not day-to-day consequences for being ceremonially impure. You just are ceremonially impure. You can't go to the temple. If you live 400 miles from the temple, how does that affect your life? It doesn't, unless you're planning a trip to the temple, and then it becomes a factor to consider. Inside the temple vicinity, ceremonial purity is an absolute requirement. And it becomes more so the closer into the center of the temple you move. So there's a space aspect where you are affects what's relevant within the Torah. Travel can affect the regulations of the Torah. Here's an interesting example that was cited in the book. Numbers 9, verse 10 and 11. Speak to the Israelites, saying, any one of you or your descendants who is unclean through touching a corpse. Now, remember, this is one of the things that makes you ceremonially unclean, is touching a corpse. Well, if somebody dies, you can't just leave the corpse alone. You have to touch it. Like, it's part of your family obligation and part of your community necessity. You don't just leave a corpse to rot out in the open. So uncleanness results. Okay, well, what do we do with that? So anyone who's unclean through touching a corpse or is away on a journey shall still keep the Passover to the Lord. In the second month, on the 14th day at twilight, they shall keep it. They shall eat it with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. Okay, that's the scriptural verse. And if you're just reading it and you're not deeply familiar, you're not going to catch the important thing, which is that the Passover is not normally celebrated in the second month. It's celebrated in the first month. So what they are saying is you're still going to have to keep Passover, but you're going to shift the time of your keeping to account for the fact that you were traveling and could not keep it in the normal way at the normal time. So there's an aspect in which travel and space affects the way that you keep the law. Time can affect the Torah, and this is pretty easy to talk about. There's all sorts of regulations about the Sabbath and about various ceremonial feasts that come throughout the year. And on those times, the rules change and are different than they are in normal time, as we say in regards to the church calendar. And even the Sabbath regulations can sometimes be overridden by the requirements of certain annual festivals. So things that you would normally not be able to do on a Sabbath might be acceptable to do if it's during an annual festival where certain preparations are required as part of that festival. So comment here from the book, another book, Jesus and the Law of Moses. Work permitted on days 1 through 6 becomes transgression if done on the Sabbath. Look at Exodus 28-10 for some biblical source for that. Sacrifices not to be offered on a regular day are mandated on a festival day, such as the Day of Atonement. Food such as leaven, which is permitted on a regular day, is prohibited during Passover. So there's all sorts of these calendar-based. Time affects how the rules apply. So very situational.
And Sabbath begins after sundown on Friday.
I believe that is the Jewish way of looking at it, yes. Okay, office can affect the Torah. So we just talked about how touching a corpse makes you ceremonially unclean. Contracting corpse impurity to bury a non-relative is permissible for non-priests. In fact, not only permissible, but expected. Like it was almost a violation of your familial duty not to deal with the corpse in that way. But it's prohibited for priests who may contract such impurity only for immediate family. So if your neighbor dies and you need to help with the corpse, that's okay for me, but it's not okay for the priest. But if the priest's wife dies, then it's okay for him to help because now it's family or his father or his brother, right? So the rules are conditional upon who you are and what type of role you play within the whole Torah system. And then again, what is permitted for priests is prohibited for the high priest, who may not contract corpse impurity for anyone, not even family members. So if you're the high priest and your wife dies, you're going to have to get somebody else to deal with the ritual of preparing the corpse for burial and, moving it into wherever it's going to be buried. You can't do it yourself. You're the high priest. You cannot contract that ritual impurity because you're the representative of the people of Israel before God, and you cannot be impure as you do that. So the Torah governs differently depending on who you are and what role you play. Similarly, kings may have some different types of abilities and restrictions and mandates than the normal people. So there's a situationality to the office that you hold. The Torah can affect the Torah because whenever you have a complex system, you're going to find that sometimes the different parts conflict with each other, right? So here's another quote from Jesus and the Law of Moses. When conflict potentially arises among laws regulating Sabbath and laws regulating the temple law often overrides Sabbath law. For example, Passover, which is a festival kept at the temple, must be kept on the 14th of Nisan, which is referenced in Numbers 9:3. If the 14th of the month coincides with the Sabbath, work necessary to observe the Passover at the right time, which is temple law, is permitted, even though such work would otherwise violate the Sabbath. So you've got a hierarchy of importance within the laws. Some are more important and override others. Obviously, gender can affect the Torah. There's differing legal obligations based on gendered realities, and these abound, such as laws pertaining to childbirth, circumcision of boys and adult men. Vows and their nullification have some slightly different rules depending on whether you're male or female. So there's a lot of gender specificity in how the laws are interpreted and kept. One of the very interesting ones that certainly plays a role in any discussion about what all of these laws mean for us here today. Ethnic and covenantal status can affect the Torah. Another quote, the law differently obligates people living in the land who are not Israelites. For example, all the congregation of Israel are to celebrate the Passover. That's in Exodus 12, verse 47. But a stranger or a hired servant may not. So that's Exodus 12, 45. May not. They may not celebrate the Passover.
Hmm.
And there are a range of regulations listed in the Torah where there's a conditionality. If you're Israelite, this applies, but if you're not, it doesn't, or it applies differently. How does that play into us as a church primarily made up of non-Israelites? Well, some of these things, whether or not they've been obsoleted, they just don't apply to us, or they don't apply to us in the same way. Here's another interesting one. Torah applies beyond humanity. Here's another quote. Cattle participate in the Sabbath rest. Exodus 20, verse 10. Even more, the people are to rest from labor so that your ox and donkey may rest. There's a concern for animal welfare in the Torah. An ox responsible for someone's death is executed by stoning. Exodus 21, verse 28. So the Torah as law, as regulations, applies not just to people, but even to the creation. Another interesting aspect of situational application of the Torah, divine discipline can affect the Torah. And here's another quote for you. Because aspects of the law regulate the temple, the sacrifices, and Israel's life in the land, the tithes and the sabbatical year, circumstances that affect these conditions affect the obligations. For example, one is not obligated to observe the sabbatical year for the land when living outside the land. The land of Israel itself may have its rest, which is spelled out in Leviticus 26, but a Jew in Babylon is not obligated to forego sowing and reaping the land of Babylon, because they are now under divine discipline. They are living outside the land, which is the land where much of the Torah is designed for. Therefore, those regulations don't apply. So there's a situationality to this. And then the last to talk about in this part, urgent needs can affect the Torah. Another quote, when life is at stake, or even suspected of being at stake, one could profane the Sabbath to administer medicine, or remove rubble off of potential victims, feed prohibited food to one in dire need, or violate a fast by feeding a pregnant woman who felt sudden hunger. And you can think of some examples in scripture. There's the story of David and his men who took the bread from the temple because they were starving. And probably that's not hyperbole. They were probably in extreme hunger at this point. And they needed food. And that overrode the Sabbath and the temple regulations that govern the use of that food. So there's certainly an aspect of, urgency can modify how we interpret the Torah. Okay, so what do we make of all this? Oh, well, at this point, I'm going to present a few quick summarizations. There's a lot in the Torah, and it's worth looking at. I mean, sometimes we want to skip over it because so much of it seems like it doesn't apply to us, and it doesn't. Or it seems like it's coming from such an immensely different cultural background that we don't even begin to understand why that regulation or that guidance would be there, which is challenging. But it's still worth looking at because it is instruction that helps to shape. If you're digging through and looking for the deeper principles and then asking yourself, how do those principles govern my life, right? There's value in doing that, which is why the psalmist just says, how I love the law, your law. I meditate on it day and night, right?
One of the best Bible studies I was ever in was with graduate students at Cornell. And we said, what book of the Bible do we know least well? And we decided to study that. We took Deuteronomy.
Okay.
And but we took these situational things, which in the law were very specific, but then tried to get underneath them. What is the principle behind this? And where does that principle show up in the way we live our lives today? And we had just a wonderful discussion all the way through Deuteronomy doing that.
And there's some really interesting stuff that you do with that. I mean, one of the examples cited from modern application of ancient principles is the Jewish debate about what do you do about lab-grown meat? What rules apply?
To what?
Lab-grown meat.
Yeah.
Like, what rules should apply? Well, at that point, you're out of a black and white. This is that, this is that. And you're digging to basic principles and trying to determine how they apply. Right?
But the law about having a parapet around your roof, because you're responsible if anybody pulls.
And that was the exact law that was in question in this little narrative that was interwoven.
Yeah. So how, what is it you have to keep safe around your house?
Right. I mean, maybe that doesn't apply today. We don't generally use our roofs as living spaces, so the need.
There are very strict rules now about
Building
having
code.
guardrails around to protect anybody who goes up to inspect or.
And it's the same principle at play. Do not allow people to be injured by your carelessness, right?
Yes.
And that is the principle.
Interpretation is required still. I mean, I was saying like police officers, but the insurance adjuster
Yeah.
has to interpret.
Yeah.
The law in that sense.
So what I want to leave you with is 3 summarizations. These are biblical summarizations of the law. First of all, Micah 6:8. He has told you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you but to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God? I mean, in a way, this is a summarization of what Torah is, right?
It's saying that repeatedly, that it's not keeping the details that God is interested in. It's whether you have the mentality
Yes.
that is being inculcated by these examples.
Exactly. And Jesus in Matthew 22, verse 37 to 40, he said to him, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment. And a second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these 2 commandments hang all the law and the prophets.
So what I said about relationship.
Yeah, very
it's
much.
about the relationship with God and the relationship with those around us, the most of those among whom we are among.
Right. And then the last one, this is the Council of Jerusalem, which was convened to deal with this thorny question of how does the Torah apply to these new Gentile, non-Israelite believers who have come into the church. And the summarization that the Council at Jerusalem came up with was this: for it has seemed good to the Holy Spirit and to us to impose on you no further burden than these essentials. But notice, they feel these are essentials: that you abstain from what has been sacrificed to idols, and from blood, and from what is strangled, and from fornication. If you keep yourselves from these, you will do well. Now, we don't even have time today to go into why those four things.
Yeah.
But I did read a very interesting, actually PhD dissertation that looked at this particular thing and tried to analyze why those four. And they took it right back to the very beginning of Genesis. These were foundational creational principles that came out of the very beginning of God's relationship with humanity. And that's why these were identified. I will note that thing about blood, very interesting that Leviticus on the butcher block talked about the use of blood, and as did a couple of the other books. And blood, there's an interesting term, lifeblood, because blood is seen almost metaphorically in the Old Testament as the agent of life. It is the thing that can cleanse the impurity. It is the thing that can bring life to the people by its application. And blood, because it is the vehicle of life, is a sacred thing that should not be profaned, which is what is coming out of the Council of Jerusalem. So if you ask yourself, why blood? Think about that.
And why was considered almost
Because the life of a being is in its blood. That was the biblical principle being applied. And if you think about, and Dell sort of hinted at this, but when we talked about ceremonial purity and impurity, menstruation as a loss of blood was a cause for impurity, but that's because there was life being lost. It was, in a way, similar to death, which is another source of impurity, right? Contacting a corpse or having menstrual bleeding, both are an exposure to the loss of life. And that's what made for the impurity. I mean, that's one way of looking at the principle. Now, it's not a principle that's clearly spelled out, so there's room for debate about what exactly was in mind, but you can certainly see it through that lens.
and from fornication.
Well, that's a different one altogether, right? But yeah, that has nothing to do with the previous one. It's a whole different problem. But
Later on, and seems to make it okay. You don't know sacrifice to idols.
right.
So even the interpretation.
Right. And that evolved as time went on. But even Paul would say, if you know it's been sacrificed to idols, like if the meat is being sold in the market and you don't know whether it was sacrificed previously, okay, you can choose to be very cautious and choose to say, I will not consume this meat because it may have been sacrificed to an idol, and that's okay. Or you can choose to say, I am recognizing that an idol is nothing, and I don't know that this has been sacrificed to an idol, and I'm not going to trouble myself with worrying about it. I'm going to just buy the meat and consume it. And that's okay too. But what isn't okay, I think, even in Paul's case, is to knowingly consume something that's been sacrificed to an idol. To deliberately ignore that fact.
Yeah.
It's not clear, but these are all judgment things, right? It's how do I apply the principles of Torah to situations that are not clearly spelled out. And so that's what I have to say about Torah. There's some books that I read that I found fascinating, and if you want to look at any of them, they're here.
Hmm.
All published in the last 5 years. These are not old books. In fact, 2 of them were just published. 3 of them were just published last year.
Thank you.
Oh, and sorry, and I realized